Welcome to the Battle of the Boards. Which stupidly massive wargaming diorama will reign scenery supreme? Will the Imperial Palace on Terra take pole position, or will the monstrous Middle-earth megaboard crush this scenery upstart? It's time to craft the biggest wargaming board in YouTube history. Here on Zorpazorp, I am deep in a scenery civil war. Over the last few years, I have been working on two absolutely massive terrain projects, the Imperial Palace on Terra and my monstrous Siege of Gondor megaboard. The Imperial Palace recently kicked off its second phase of the mega build as we began a whole new portion of this massive scenery in epic scale. But as I found myself whisked back to Australia where all of my original scenery is still in storage, it was time for the Middle-earth megaboard to respond as we return to an absolutely classic piece of Zorpazorp scenery. And this Middle-earth megaboard, well, it's about to get even bigger. Like, a lot bigger. Last month, we knocked over this full-size campaign map of Middle-earth, because next year we are going to hold a mental campaign that sees players of my local New Zealand community battling over the entire map of Middle-earth. But that means we have to build the entire map of Middle-earth at Warhammer scale. Now, the Siege of Gondor megaboard is a phenomenal start, spanning the war-torn streets of Osgiliath, across the Pelennor, all the way up to the White Walls of Minas Tirith, and with this first section of Minas Tirith almost finished, it's time to look at some other key Middle-earth locations. The Siege of Gondor megaboard will get bigger as we add other nearby regions of Middle-earth, Caer Andros, Amon Han, and Athelion as we move north, and then into the many battlegrounds of Rohan, lining up with my Edoras board, and a whole host of other important regions moving into the west. But today, we're looking even further north and finishing a board that will end up directly above the Siege of Gondor megaboard, just a few map tiles away. Now, to make this process super smooth, I've actually rented a second storage unit just down the aisle, which we're going to turn into a makeshift studio for the next 2 weeks before we sail across the ditch to New Zealand. So we're going to need some tables. A couple of trestles should do us nicely. And then it's time for a lighting solution. A couple of fluoro tubes mounted up above the board should give us enough light to get crafting. Now we can set up the trestles and then grab every toolkit and box of scenic related goodness and throw them up the back of the studio to keep them nice and handy. So what part of Middle-earth are we adding to my massive mega board today? Well, let me give you guys a hint. It is my absolute favorite board, and it's about time it got finished. Yes, at long last, we are finally returning to the most complex and detailed build in Zorpazorp history, the fortress of the necromancer, Dol Guldur. So as you can see, it is absolutely mental in here, and to be perfectly honest, I'm not actually sure where the Dol Guldur board is. Going on massive scenery builds like these mega boards is a massive journey, a quest to explore and discover, and like any good journey, we need to travel in style, and there's no better way to fly than the USS Enterprise in Star Trek Fleet Command. And there's so much to explore, with an amazing open world, a vast and diverse space landscape from the Alpha to Omega Quadrant, and the world just comes to life with stunning graphics, rich with intricate detail, and breathtaking space-based visuals. With the game being free to play, there is a thriving community of real players to support your journey through the Star Trek universe. Friendships are made and alliances are formed as you connect with other players online. The inclusion of beloved Star Trek characters like Captain Kirk and Spock allows players to step into their shoes of their favorite Starfleet officers and command legendary vessels like never before. Not to mention the epic battles with players from all across the world, and with a huge diversity in playstyles, each battle is unique and engaging. Download Star Trek Fleet Command from the link in my description and use the promo code WARPSPEED to get 10 epic shards of Captain Kirk, who is a powerful officer providing strong buffs to any ship that he is on. Choose your own path and discover mysteries that only you can solve as you boldly go where no one has gone before. Install the game and immerse yourself in the Star Trek universe. So I dragged out a whole bunch of stuff from the unit, which was just such a nostalgia trip. Rediscovering all of the scenery that I'd left behind was like reconnecting with old friends.
It's amazing. This place is basically like a big time capsule for the channel. There's bits of builds all over the place, more recent stuff up the front like Osgiliath, the Imperial Palace, and then all the old stuff mixed through as we go deeper back. Down here at the bottom, up the front and nice and accessible, I have found Dol Guldur. It's a lot bigger than I imagined. Currently, Dol Guldur is in a bunch of pieces. The plastic Games Workshop ruins for the very top, some resin ruin components of my own, the foam carved foundation of the courtyard, the dungeon tiles for the inside level, boxes and boxes of spare parts, and of course the massive cliff foundation and baseboard. I also grabbed a bunch of extra foam for some more cliff work and a bunch of the fortress we're about to start carving. It really is quite a lot of scenery. I slapped down all the parts into the makeshift studio and then had to remember how this crazy structure goes together. The inside of the fortress is fully interiored with a modular dungeon that can be accessed by lifting off the upper stories, but all of the pieces need to lock together in just the right way for all the upper levels to line up nicely. Now this is looking beastly, but there are some huge sections of cliff work yet to be finished, some landforming, a roadway and flights of stairs up to that arch tunnel, and then I want to build 2 gates on the lower level that will link up with stairwells on the next section of the board. Oh yeah, did I mention that this is just the first 12 square feet of the full 80 square foot layout?
This guy is always so much bigger than I remember, but he's actually way less finished. There's like detailing and landforming and quite a lot to do. This is going to be a pretty massive task.
I decided the easiest way to begin was from the ground up, so we're going to start on the lower level and tackle the many unfinished rocky outcrops. I grabbed my box of not very many left plaster cast rock molds and my hot glue gun and started gluing in a few more rocky outcroppings to fill in the last of the gaps on the southern side of the tower foundation. I used my hot glue gun to get a hot fast grab, but I let the glue cool just a bit before smushing on the rockwork so that the hot glue doesn't melt the expanded white foam. Then my mate Ryan from Battlecraft Hobbies came to the rescue and let me steal the last of his modelling compound so we can turn all of these rocky outcrops into one cohesive cliff face. Working in small batches because this stuff dries really fast in the Australian summer heat, I poured in some water and mixed it up to a paste, and then I smush it in all of the joins. And then once that's in place and going hard after about 10 minutes, I come back with just wet fingers, just water on my fingers, and I smooth and blend all of the surfaces together, reactivating the plaster components to smooth the whole cliff face into one homogeneous structure. This blending phase is really crucial for a realistic finish, and you'll see just how amazing this product is once we start to paint it all up later on. I spun the board around and tackled the northern side of the tower, which I was a bit nervous about because I'm running really low on rock molds, so I had to use heaps of small ones, layering them together, and I wasn't sure that it was going to sort of all look nicely blended, but lesson 1 of Zorpazorp is never doubt the power of modeling compound. Amazing stuff. I then jumped to the western side of the board to the northern stairwell, which will eventually join to the second half of the board, and then I added a bunch more rock casts to kind of keep building the aesthetic that this fortress has been built into the rocky foundation of the hill known as Amon Lunk. With those cliff faces done, the board is looking nice, but there's one pretty obvious bit of unfinished foam on the southern side, which actually isn't going to just be more rock molds. I've left this space for the beginning of our lower foundation, which will actually be the start of the southern gatehouse. I knew I wanted a pretty meaty structure for this gatehouse, so I got out all of my old resin cast buildings from my old Angmar board and started having a play with a bunch of the structures. There's nice pieces to work with here, and we've already used a bunch of these components throughout this build to complement Games Workshop's plastic kits and the sort of new foam carved brickwork I've done, and I just love the kind of hodgepodge evil nature we're getting by mixing all of these nasty structures together. I tried a lot of the loose components, but I just could not get what I wanted working, so I said a little prayer of forgiveness to Aule and smashed up one of my old buildings to reforge it anew. This square building is awesome, but I need diamond footprints with lots of acute angles that works really well for this build, so I grabbed the wall parts and changed the door connector, pinning the walls together with wooden skewers and rod. I grabbed the box of offcuts of extruded foam, and then started messing about with making a nice foundation for this structure, trimming away part of the polystyrene to get everything to mount flush, and then lining up my walls and adding a big solid wall to cover up that white polystyrene, and then building a nice thick platform complete with a sweet floor tile pattern of diamonds and triangles, and then an outer stair trim. To blend it nicely, I grabbed some rock molds and kind of massaged the cliff face to come into the brickwork and blended it with some filler that I made by mixing up some plaster and cellulose fibers. This is basically homemade modeling compound, as I'd now run out of Ryan's bag. It's not quite as good, but hopefully it'll still get the job done. I had some left over, so I started working on the landforming, smoothing out the slopes of the hillside, and then realized that I wanted to carve in a couple of nice sort of terraced flights of stairs, and started with a large single stair to trim the upper platform on the southern side, before carving a small flight of stairs from a large block of foam, and then trimming that down so that it'll kind of drop in nicely on the existing slope that I've got on the board. Over on the northern side, we have a pretty different slope, so I opted for 2 different flights of stairs as it kind of slopes down, and then I angled the lower flight to sort of wrap around the contour of the road and hug in against those cliffs, and I just loved the way that this looked. In fact, I loved it so much, I went back to the southern side and I cut up the landforming that I'd just done to make another cool angled flight of stairs. There will be no right angles in Dol Guldur. I blended in all of those stairs with some more compound mix, and then it was time to jump back to the western side to work on the northern gate. This guy is going to be a bit smaller than that big southern structure, but I still want to use some resin arches, so I had to play with my parts, smashing up yet another building to cannibalize it for goodies, and found a nice way to join a cool kind of cut down arch wall with one of the ruined walls using another joiner. So I pinned and glued that all together, and then made another foundation just like the south side before carving in a texture and gluing it all in place with some massive spikes to make sure it was nice and strong. Now, this particular location is where we first see the Witch King and his Morgul blade in the Hobbit films after he tries to shank Radagast, and in a crazy coincidence, I spent a full day in the Weta Workshop Armory forging a real Morgul blade from Lord of the Rings with the master swordsmith Peter Lyon, who made the original weapons for Peter Jackson's movies. The video on the build went up last week and I'm really proud of it, and it would just mean the world to me if you guys would check it out after this one. I've got the link down in the description and the pinned comment. So there we have our landforming finally finished. Our next phase is to do one last final detail pass on the upper fortress before we can really start to throw down some paint. Up in the main courtyard, the foundation was carved from 2 30mm thick sheets, which have a really obvious join, so I blended them together with some filler, but I left the upper layer of flagstones unblended to really emphasize how the floor tiles on the courtyard had been laid over the foundation. Then I grabbed all the remaining plastic kits that Rob Alderman from the Middle-earth team had sent to me all those years ago when this build was started, and I've basically used everything. All that is left here is the gorgeous details, the vines and corpses, the metal spikes and chains. First I decided to mount the kind of balcony battlements to the foam foundation, so they're nice and strong. So I drilled some holes into the plastic low ruined wall pieces, and then used some wooden pegs down into the foam to hold it all firmly with a mix of super glue and PVA. Then I spent about an hour just faffing about, trying to find a cool way to blend plastic components with the foam layers. I was going to use all of the pillars to run a big huge line all the way down the outer wall from the battlement pillars, but it just looked too busy. So I ended up going for a less is more approach and just added a little accent underneath each pillar to break up the straight line of the foam and the plastic layers. I then repeated the same on the north side, but because of the cliff foundation, I continued the pillars down the stonework and stopping at the cliff, and then just fell in love with how that looked and immediately regretted not doing something more similar on the northern side. Maybe I'll redo it later, we'll have to wait and see. Then I decided to chuck the entire board outside and give all of the stonework a big old prime with rattle cans. Firstly, I used a sheet of A4 paper as a foldable mobile mask to protect all of our plaster rock molds. We need to keep these white and unpainted so that we can blend washes straight onto the plaster later on. I also need to avoid all of my white and green foam components. With all of the grey base coat down, I gave all of the pieces a big zenithal prime with a lighter grey to give me a cheap pass at some stone definition and help all of the details read to the eye. I did this individually on each component and then again once the full board was assembled so we can get some nice natural light source blending. Then it was back to the studio to check it all out, and hot damn, how good does this stonework look with just a simple spritz of paint. There's heaps of work to do to go, but for now I'm going to swap down to the cliffs and I jump straight into my favourite scenic technique, leopard spotting. This involves painting some diluted washes straight onto the plaster in a really splotchy method, sometimes even flicking the paint off the side of the brush with 3 colors, a brown, greeny brown, and a yellow ochre. And then I blend those all together with an all-over black wash. On the southern side, I accidentally made my yellow ochre a little too strong. I always overmix one of them, and so I had to try and kind of hide that under some heavier black washing, but I corrected it on the northern side, and I was much happier with the result I achieved there. Now the real kicker here, and my favorite little rock technique, which I came up with myself by accident one day, is that before you apply any sealant to lock in your color, you dry your brush until it's damp and has no paint on it, and then overbrush the entire rock face really aggressively. This will rub the paint off on the highlights of the plaster cast, which creates this kind of really nice chalky quartzy highlight, which gives you a nice pop and makes the rocks just look really natural. I then had to place an order from my own shop, Zorpazorp.com, which my manager Marky sent down to me super fast, cheers dude, to restock the Aussie storage unit with scenic supplies, because I sent them all to New Zealand, and now we are ready to throw down some ground coverings. I went to my tried and trusted scrublands as my foundation, as the rocky aggregate blend kind of matches my cliff face tones perfectly, and I then wanted a little bit more of a foresty green, so I then layered in some pine forest ground covering, which has some lovely pine needle fibers and kind of phlox mixed through the soil blend. I shaped this blend on the other side of the board, but left some space for the remnants of the old road, and decided, based on the scenics that I'd ordered, just to use my rubble blend, a mix of city rubble and grimdark city rubble, to lay down the base tones of the road. Then to blend that in as like an overgrown, crumbled roadway, I sprinkled in some more of my pine forest ground cover. I repeated the process on the southern side, having some fun winding a couple of roads around in that larger space, and then threw down some grass tufts to start adding to the ground coverings, opting for some dead tufts just to keep to kind of that sickly vibe of Dol Guldur. The fortress needs a whole bunch of extra details: skulls, metal spikes, corpses, and of course a huge paint job. The cliffs need more mosses and rubble, and the ground covering needs a whole damn forest infested with spiders. I cannot wait to finish it off, so that it can earn its place in the biggest wargaming board in YouTube history.